Hello and welcome to EE333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to focus on our export custom and export XML functions. In an earlier video, we had created these static functions that we could use in our user driver, particularly in our main of the user driver, to then drive our user class and the associated functions that go along with it. And once again, in this one, we're going to focus on the export custom and the export XML. In particular, we're going to talk about a sad case involving three fictional brothers. And it's not really so sad, but it's a good example of some of the functionality in our user class. And so to begin with, we want to tell the story about three brothers, Joe, Jim, and Jack Jones. And the reason that I say that it is a sad story is you're going to discover that one of these three brothers is a little more proactive than the other two. And how we're going to do this. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create three instances or three objects of our user class. So we're going to start off user, and if we use the package, then what we would do is we'd specify user 333 e333.user. That's going to be the object type. We're going to call this first one user1, and we're simply going to make it equal to a new ee333.user. And what we're going to do is we're going to specify the constructor, the second constructor, the one that requires an ID, the first name and the last name. We said earlier that was sort of the minimum amount of information that we could pass for a user. So the sad part of this story is that one of these three brothers, Joe, is more proactive than his other two siblings. And so what he has done is he has actually went through the trouble of getting an ID and picking an ID, whereas Jim and Jack are a little more lackadaisical about things, and they let the system pick their ID for them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to leverage some of the functions that we wrote in an earlier video along with our class level collection that keeps track of all of the current users. And to do this, what we're going to do is we are going to first create a user where we specify then the ID. And so our Joe Jones is actually specified that he wants to be J Jones. His first name, of course, is Joe, and his last name is Jones. The second user, in other words, his brother, user 2, is going to take the other route and letting the system specify his ID, auto-generate it. So he's going to use the constructor that simply accepts two input arguments, so Jim and Jones. And then the third user is going to be Jack. So they're going to be he's going to be user 3, e333.user, and then Jack, first name, and then Jones is the last name. Now, what we want to do, just to simply make sure that we are successfully creating these three users, we can do a couple of things. First thing that we can do is we can actually just simply leverage the toString that would come with the object. Okay, in other words, it's inherited from the Java framework. Or what we could do is we can leverage the export custom and ultimately the export XML functions that return a string, a specially crafted string that represents the object. And so to do this, what we're going to do is we're just going to say system.out.println. All right, and then we simply specify user1 dot export custom. We're going to do the same thing for our user 2 and likewise for our user 3. And for aesthetics purposes, I want to take just a second here. I'm going to put an additional line in between here just so that we have an easier time with the output. So we're going to do this real quick. Nothing magic about the divider or anything like that. Just going to create a nice border if you would. All right, go ahead and save this. Go ahead and build it. I'm going to come over here to my command window. And if you recall from earlier, we should have our EE333 package. Inside that folder is going to be the classes, the user class and the user driver class. We want to use the Java runtime engine to then simply run our EE333.user driver. And because we didn't specify any arguments, we simply get unhandled switch. To drive this appropriately, we need to pass the switch that corresponds to the function. So in this case, it's going to be our exportXML. So, or exportCustom rather, and later we will do the exportXML. And you should now get a nice or relatively nice output. But notice more importantly that the more proactive of the three siblings got his ID, J. Jones, and then the others were automatically chosen by the system. To take a look at one of our earlier videos, you'll see how I set up a loop to simply check to see if the ID had already been used, and if so, generate a new one just by adding an integer onto the end. One little minor thing to note here is that we've maintained the capitalization from the first letter of the first name and the last name. If you would like to keep all of your user IDs lowercase, then what you would want to do is go back to your user.java and then add an additional line in here that simply says ID is equal to ID.to lowercase. And what that will do is that will simply take all of the capital letters and then convert them over to lowercase before checking to see the availability of the ID. Likewise, we can do that up here when we first initialize or create the first ID to test by simply saying ID is equal to ID.to lowercase. And then probably not a bad idea to force this in the other overload, and simply if the user specifies a ID with uppercase, then down here, then in the else, we simply say this.id is equal to ID.to lowercase. Once again, not extremely critical, but it does keep consistency in our system. All right, so now let's work on the persistent storage of these objects. And what I mean by that is saving them to the file system with the same extension as our sample.user. And so if you recall from earlier lectures, we had to create two different objects to be able to do this. One is of type file, and the other one is a file writer. So the first thing we want to do is we want to declare two new variables up here. One is going to be of type java.io.file, and we're simply going to call this one output file. And to keep consistent here, we're going to use a lowercase o. And then the second one that we want to create is that file writer. So it's java.io.filewriter. And that is going to be an output file writer. A little long-winded as far as the name goes. But if you notice here, then we want to go ahead and create, if you recall from the last time we did this, when we created these, we did not initialize them, because in order to do that, you actually have to have a try-catch statement. And so what we want to do is we'll set up our try-catch structure here. Some curly braces here. Let's see if we can get this set up correctly. Okay, and specifically we want to capture an exception whenever we use our file writer. And what we want to also do is, instead of storing each one of these users in, put all the users in a file, we actually want to store them in separate files. And so what we're going to do is we're going to construct the file name from their ID. So essentially it's a way of maintaining that unique ID, because the file system only allows for one file with a given name. So file names have to be exclusive here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say output file is going to be equal to new java.io.file. And what we're going to do is we're going to specify the user one. We're going to specify their ID, and on that ID, we're going to concatenate the .user file extension. Okay, and we're ultimately going to do this 3 times, but we're going to start off first with our user one. The second step then is going to be to create the, or initialize rather, the output file writer. So in this case, output file writer is going to be equal to new java.io.file writer. And for that, we have to specify an output file, and then we can also specify whether we want to overwrite it. Now, in this particular case, we're not worried about saving the state of the previous file. If anything, we would preface this by importing all of the existing files, making the changes, and then exporting it back onto the file system. But we're going to get into those details. That's one of the reasons why you want to leverage the status enum. But coming back to this now, what we want to do is we want to open that file writer, okay, and we want to append to that file the formatted contents of our object here. So it's going to be output file writer dot append, and then what we want to do here is we want to take our user one and we want to export the contents or the formatted string of our user one, and we want to simply write it to that file. As always, you want to make sure to close the file when you're done with it. So output file writer dot close. And then, while it is a little bit unwieldy to do this, we are simply going to do this 3 times here. So the user 2 is going to get their own file. And then lastly, user 3 is going to get their own file. And then under the catch, we're simply going to have a system.out.println of the message provided by the toString method of the exception. Okay, now there is one flaw in this approach, and that is that any of our files, opening the files, writing the files causes an exception, then any subsequent users won't get written. But that's, once again, not really the purpose of this particular example here. This particular example is just an opportunity for us to create 3 objects and write their contents to files. And also note that we've not been particularly rigorous here. If you recall from just a few minutes ago, we haven't provided an address, a city, or a state for any of our samples. So we would want to go back here and add those in to make this a complete test. But for right now, I want to go ahead and build it. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen. I'm going to rerun this one now. And I don't have any errors, which is good. And then if I type in dir, you'll see that I have 3 additional files here, all with the .user file extension. And if I launch Explorer in the current directory, if I take one of our .user files and I simply drag it over and drop it into NetBeans, you'll see that while, yes, it is missing some of the additional information, it does have the correct structure for our sample.user file. So basically now we've got the ability of exporting our users to the .user or the custom file extension. Now, I'm going to leave it to you to add the additional properties such as the address, the city, and the state to verify this particular one. You can also do the exact same approach now to your export custom. So once again, I'm going to leave both of those for you to complete. And if you find this video helpful, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me.